One of my favourite descriptions of continuous delivery is working so that your software is always in a releasable state. But that doesn't really say anything about when to actually release changes into production. One of the commonest assumptions that most people make when talking about continuous delivery is that it means constant release. Actually, that approach goes by a slightly different name. So, what should go into our decision to release, and how often should we release changes into production? Hi, I'm Dave Farley of Continuous Delivery. Welcome to my channel. If you haven't already, please do hit subscribe and hit the bell notification icon so that we can keep you informed of new episodes as they're released. Also, if you enjoy the video, do hit like. That tells the YouTube algorithm that my channel's worth watching. In this episode, I want to explore the decision to release into production. A good way to think about continuous delivery is that we're trying to maximize feedback. But there are different levels of feedback that are important to us. We're interested in the technical feedback on the quality of our changes, which we can get best from a fast, effective, efficient deployment pipeline. But we're also interested in feedback on the products that we create. You can think of the first as answering the question, are we building things right? And the second as answering, are we building the right things? Our deployment pipelines give us a repeatable, reliable way to ensure that we are building things right. If you take my advice and organise your deployment pipeline so that it goes from commit to releasable outcome, the pipeline now gives us a definitive statement on releasability. If your change passes the evaluations in the deployment pipeline, it's good to release. And that puts us in a great position to move forwards. If you would like to learn more about how to achieve the confidence that we are building things right, check out my training courses, Better Software Faster and Anatomy of a Deployment Pipeline. But for the other question, are we building the right things? The only way to check is to release and see what our users make of our changes. What we are talking about here is the difference between continuous delivery and continuous deployment. Continuous deployment is a valuable release strategy for continuous delivery, but it's not the only one. Let's just make sure that we're on the same page with definitions. Continuous delivery, if the pipeline says that our change has passed, there's no more work to do. It is releasable. The pipeline is definitive. But we could choose to initiate the deployment itself either automatically or manually. Continuous delivery has nothing to say on that. Continuous deployment is if all of the automation says that everything is good, we're just going to release into production. The second of these, continuous deployment, is what many people assume continuous delivery is all about. But I think that there's a little bit more to each than that. In fact, they are quite closely related, of course. But while you can certainly practice continuous delivery in the absence of continuous deployment, you can't really practice continuous deployment without practicing continuous delivery first. The next question that crops up is, which is right for you? The simplest answer for most systems is probably practice continuous deployment if you can. But this is a bit too simple. Let's parse the idea a little bit. Remember, all of this begins with a functioning deployment pipeline to determine releasability. There are many good reasons to prefer smaller, simpler releases. By increasing the frequency of release, we inevitably reduce the size of each change. Amazon releases changes on average once every 11.2 seconds. Since they've adopted that approach, they saw a 90% reduction in the time to fix problems caused by release. That's because each of the changes is smaller. If each change is smaller, it's also simpler. If each change is simpler, there are fewer places for mistakes to hide. There's also a psychological effect. If we know that every successful commit will be automatically pushed into production, we are going to take a little bit more care with each commit. Here's some bad maths to demonstrate what I'm talking about. So let's look at this from the point of view of the total risk to releasing change. The risk of releasing change is going to be some kind of function depending on the scale of the change. Inevitably, if we produce more software, there's going to be more chance that there's a problem with it. So we could imagine that associated with every change that we make, there's a small element of risk. So if we release less frequently and have a larger number of changes, then we're going to have to sum up the risk associated with all of those changes. But there's another part of this total risk function. There's also the chance that two or more changes may interact with each other in an unpleasant way. And that part of the function is going to go up exponentially, not linearly. And so the risk of interaction is going to be dependent on the number of changes. The more changes that we have, the higher the likelihood that two or more of them are going to interact in some unpleasant way that we didn't predict. So the total risk is very much a function of the number of changes. And that's an important factor in calculating that risk. What this means is that, somewhat counterintuitively, releasing more frequently is less risky. Dividing things up into smaller, simpler steps is the less risky strategy. This isn't just theory, by the way. We have data from the State of DevOps report that says that there is no trade-off between speed and quality. This is counterintuitive for sure, but it goes on to say more than that. Teams that release more frequently score higher on quality than teams that don't. In addition to reducing risk, though, releasing more frequently also gives us more opportunities to learn. I see making progress in a series of small steps as a foundational building block for continuous delivery. So continuous deployment is the best strategy, right? Well, mostly, but not always. The trouble with continuous deployment, trouble is probably not quite the right word, but the complexity with continuous deployment is, for some systems, is that the timing is dictated by the producer, the software development team, rather than the consumer. One of the firms that practice continuous delivery in a sophisticated way is Volvo Trucks. If I was a Swedish lorry driver driving on a winter's night along an icy mountain road with a 300-metre drop to a field alongside me, I wouldn't really want a software update at that moment, if I am honest. A better strategy perhaps would be consumer-driven, for the consumer to decide when it's safe to take the update. In this case, the consumer is probably the truck, to decide when it's safe, and perhaps when it's tucked away in a nice warm cosy garage, it's going to take the updates at that point. So the decision to release is really much more of a business decision than a technical one. In other circumstances, it may not always be possible to release for other reasons, perhaps a regulatory constraint or for commercial reasons. You can't release half a financial exchange unless you want to get shut down by the finance regulators. Or maybe your MVP is still a bit too M. In these situations, the trick is not to fall back onto old bad habits. Continue to work so that your software is in a releasable state. You get that technical feedback and the ability to release when you want to if you do that. That is to continue to practice continuous delivery. But also, figure out how you can answer the question, are we building the right things? Can you release to a friendly, maybe even internal collection of users who can give you that feedback? This, in fact, is still an MVP, a minimum viable product. An experiment with your product targeted specifically at teaching us what works or maybe what doesn't. When I worked building one of the world's highest performance financial exchanges at LMAX, applying these kinds of techniques, we took a couple of different strategies to getting this kind of are we building the right thing product. The first was that we did a release that kind of was outside of the of the financial regulatory constraints of building an exchange. We built a game first, a trading game on top of our technology, and there was lighter regulation associated with that kind of system. So we could try out some ideas in production with a game-like system. But the other thing that we did much earlier than that was that we released internally. On Friday afternoons, everybody in the company, a small startup, would stop working on whatever it was that they were doing from whichever part of the company they were in, and they would use the system to trade, and we would play trading against each other with fake money, but we would trade based on the real prices in markets against each other. And we learnt a huge amount about what worked and what didn't from a product point of view, from a usability point of view, through doing that kind of exercise. You don't get to learn these kinds of lessons by guessing. You get to learn these kinds of lessons by putting your software in front of real human beings and seeing what they make of it. I think that it's useful to think about these two distinct categories of feedback. The technical focus of continuous delivery and the product focus of continuous deployment. They each give valuable, critical, but different insight into what it is that we are building. Then, with this information, we can tune our approach and match our business needs. Thank you very much for watching.